we're going to at least proceed on that basis at least. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you this afternoon. I'm Jerry West. I'm one of the elders here at the Stadium Boulevard congregation. Someone asked, why are you speaking on this topic? Do you have any special expertise and so forth? I think perhaps the reason I'm speaking on this topic is that Mark Mancini heard me teach a class involving this topic a couple of years ago, and so he suggested that I handle this topic on the seminar. I am an economist by profession, but I really don't feel like I'm an expert in this area. I hope I have some thoughts that I can share with you that will be helpful. I want to stress the biblical perspective, but I want to also, toward the end of my presentation, talk about some of the practical things that we need to watch for in terms of management of personal finances. You might ask the question first, why do we need to consider proper management of personal finances? Now, I think there are 3 or 4 reasons why this is needed. First, just the biblical idea that we need to be good stewards. And for many of you, you're going to be employed, financed, supported, if you will, by the Lord's money. And so from that standpoint, I think we ought to all try to be good stewards, and that's true whether you're working for the church on a full-time basis or whether you're like myself, you're employed with someone else, because all that I have is the Lord's, and I need to be a good steward of it. The second point, I think, is that we need to be good managers to help reduce some of the difficulties, some of the hassles. I'm convinced that if we learn how to be somewhat careful in the management of our personal finances, that we can avoid some of the real problems. And so it would be with that thought in mind that if I can help you in any way in terms of give you some ideas of things that you might practice that will keep you out of trouble, in other words, more serious trouble, then that would be one of my major objectives. I think there's another important one, and that's from the standpoint of avoiding bringing reproach upon the church. We can get in such serious difficulty that we do that. Unfortunately, I had an experience like this when I was in the state of Michigan back in the late 1950s doing graduate work. We had a minister who got himself in such serious financial difficulties that he left East Lansing owing people money, and he brought reproach upon the church from that standpoint. And so I think, hopefully, that none of you will ever do that, none of us will ever do that, but that's one of the things I think we need to watch. And then just to provide contentment. I'd like for us to focus on this afternoon, if we might, and I'm going to suggest that this is the thing we're going to be striving for. A couple of passages we might notice to start out with. First, in Hebrews 13, verse 5, Paul, or whoever wrote the book of Hebrews, suggests that let your way of life be free from the love of money. And then notice this phrase, being content with what you have. Paul himself exemplified this in Philippians, the 4th chapter, beginning with verse 11. He says, not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. That's Philippians 4, verses 11 and 12. I'd like for us to just think this afternoon and talk about some ways that we might reach the point where we could, along with Paul, say, I've learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. Now, I think in order to do that, we have to consider the fact that there's 2 parts involved in that. There's our part and there's God's part. And we're going to, if some of you'd like to get up and move, by the way, you might be, I'm going to be using some overhead, so if you'd like to move around that way where you can see better, or as long as I'm not in your way, well, all right. But thank you, brother. First, I want us to look at God's part, because this is an attitude that we have to develop before we can follow through in terms of our part. One of the first things I think we have to recognize is, as I mentioned earlier, that everything belongs to the Lord. Turn with me to 1 Chronicles, if you would. 1 Chronicles, the 29th chapter. 1 Chronicles 29, verses 11 and 12. David is speaking here in verse 11. He says, "Thine, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty. Indeed, everything that is in the heavens and the earth. Thine is the dominion, O Lord, and thou dost exalt thyself as head over all. Both riches and honor come from thee, and thou dost rule over all. And in thy hand is power and might, and it lies in thy hand to make great and to strengthen everyone." Notice that phrase back in the 11th verse there. He says, "Indeed, everything that is in the heavens and the earth." He said, those are thine. In other words, everything belongs to God. You can look at some more specific scriptures. I'll just give you those. We won't turn to them. But Leviticus 25:23 talks about the land belonging to God. Psalms 50 verse 10 talks about the animals belonging to God. Haggai chapter 2 verse 8 talks about the silver and gold belonging to God. So first, from just the standpoint of ownership, we might look at that from this standpoint. In other words, that as far as God's part is concerned, it includes the ownership, and then secondly, it includes the control. Notice the passage that we looked at in 1 Chronicles 29. It's talked about, he says, "And thou dost rule over all." Another passage we might look at is in Zechariah, one that I ran across in a study of the post-exile period in one of our Bible classes a few months ago, that really meant something special to me, and I hope it will to you. Zechariah, the 4th chapter. If you have trouble with remembering those, Zechariah comes just before Malachi. Zechariah 4, verse 6. This, to give you the setting for this was written at the time that the Israelites had come back to Jerusalem and they were rebuilding the temple, but they had been hindered, and had been their work had been stopped for something like 20 years, and they were being encouraged to resume building on the temple. But notice verse 6. This is the angel speaking, as it indicates in verse 5. He says, "Then he answered and said to me, This is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel, saying, Not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord of hosts." And he goes on to say, "What are you, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel you will become a plain, and he will bring forth the top stone with shouts of grace, grace to it." Well, you study the context and so forth there if you'd like, but the point it seems to be making is that Zerubbabel, you're going to be able to accomplish it, but it's not going to be by your power and might, but by the Spirit of the Lord. And this is the same thing with respect to the control of everything that exists. It belongs to God. Third point that we have here is provision. God's part is that of providing. A number of passages we could look at there. We could look at Matthew 6, but let's look at Luke 12. A couple of verses in Luke 12 that emphasize this point. Verses 30 and 31. Luke 12, verses 30 and 31. He says, "For all these things the nations of the world eagerly seek, but your Father knows that you need these things. But seek for His kingdom, and these things shall be added to you." It's a promise. He says, God knows what you need, and He says, if you seek the kingdom, all these things will be provided for you. Now, one thing we may need to get straight: what are our needs? And I think 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 8 may clue us in a little bit there. 1 Timothy 6, verse 8 reads, "And if we have food and covering, with these we shall be content." So, as I say, our needs may be a lot more limited than we sometimes think. Paul suggests there in writing to Timothy that if we have food and covering, or clothing, with these we shall be content. But the promise is there, the guarantee, for example, and it's indicated, the guarantee is provided also in Philippians 4, verse 19. where Paul says, "And my God shall supply all your needs according to his riches in glory in Christ Jesus." So the point we're making here is that when we start thinking about our personal finances, one of the first things we need to recognize is that God has the important part here. That everything is his, that he controls everything, and that he'll provide what we need. Now, we have our part, and we're going to talk about that as well. But I think it's basic that we understand that everything belongs to God. Someone has suggested in talking about this that it may be helpful for some people to actually sit down and write down all their possessions in order to really get the proper perspective here. To write down all of their possessions, and then write out a will or a deed and say, "I'm deeding these over to you, God, because they're yours for what you're doing, for what you do for me." But at any rate, the point is, God has an important role to play here, and we need to keep this in mind. Now, as I indicated, we're going back to our first point here. To reach this contentment, we not only have to look at God's part, we also have to look at our part. And so that's what we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about. Let's turn to Matthew, the 25th chapter, verse 21. Matthew 25, verse 21. Jesus is speaking, of course, and he's telling a parable here, and he says, "His master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master.'" I think as stewards of what God has given us, that we need to be good and faithful stewards. And I think this passage emphasizes that point. One of the things I'd like to suggest to you is that money affects man. There's no way that we can avoid it. Money affects man. And it can prove to be either a blessing or a curse. And let me just suggest to you some ways in which, depending on whether we're a faithful steward or not, some of the things that we become. In acquiring, we become a benefactor or an extractor. In spending, we become a provider or a prodigal. In saving, we become a conserver or a miser. In giving, we become a philanthropist or a patronizer. In accounting, we become a creditor or a debtor. In influencing others, we become a stepping stone or a stumbling block. Now, what are some good guides so that we can come out there on the right side of all of these things? Well, first, turn to Luke, the 16th chapter. Luke 16, verses 10 and 11. He says, "He who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much, and he who is unrighteous in a very little thing is unrighteous also in much. If therefore you have not been faithful in the use of unrighteous mammon, who will entrust the true riches to you?" So I think this suggests the point that we're supposed to be righteous, faithful in the use of unrighteous mammon. We're supposed to be faithful in that. I think we need to have the reputation that Daniel had. Over in Daniel, the 6th chapter, verse 4. It's interesting to note Daniel's reputation. Daniel 6, verse 4 says, "Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him." No negligence or corruption was to be found in him. I think that gives us a good guide or a good goal to work for. Now what I want to do is to talk about some areas as far as our part of managing personal finances is concerned. The first area I want to talk about is one sometimes that we don't like to emphasize. That's one of giving. And I think probably most of you are familiar with the typical passages that are looked at in terms of giving. Look at Matthew 6, verses 19 and 20. Look at 2 Corinthians 8, first 3 or 4, about the first 5 verses there. Look at 1 Timothy 6, verses 18 and 19. Look at 2 Corinthians 9, verse 7, 1 Corinthians 16, verse 2. All of those are passages, say, that we look at with respect to giving. But I have a little concern, and personally I share this with you in terms of people, I think, sometimes in the ministry, that sometimes we can develop the attitude, well, I'm giving myself, and that I have no responsibility in terms of giving on the Lord's Day. Or that, well, I'm getting by, I'm getting so little, in other words, that I have no responsibilities there. Turn to Numbers, the 18th chapter, verse 26. Numbers 18, verse 26. This, of course, relates to the old law. It relates to the Levitical priesthood, but perhaps there's something here we ought to notice in terms of, at least in terms of way of example. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Moreover you shall speak to the Levites and say to them, When you take from the sons of Israel the tithe which I have given you from them for your inheritance, then you shall present an offering to the Lord, from it to the Lord, a tithe of the tithe. Now, I'm not suggesting to you that we tithe today, but the point I'm making is that the Levites received a tithe from all the people for their support, but they turned around and gave a tithe of that tithe. So I think it's something we need to think about, and I think from the standpoint of not only responsibility but also from the standpoint of example, I think those in the ministry, or any leaders for that matter in the church, have to also give attention to this matter. I think it's interesting to notice Paul's, what I would refer to as pod of peas with respect to giving. One, it's personal. 1 Corinthians 16 says, let each one of you. Second, it's purposed. It's purposed. It's something that we plan, and it's not to be haphazard. Thirdly, it's periodic, every first day of the week. Fourth, it's as prospered. So those are some things I think can serve as guides in this area. A second part in terms of our part as far as dealing with personal finances relates to escaping debt. Someone suggested you might paraphrase that this way: act your wage. Act your wage. I think most of you have probably seen Romans 13, verse 8. It says, owe nothing to anyone. There's a proverb, Proverbs 22, that relates to this matter of debt. Proverbs 22, verse 7. Proverbs 22, verse 7 says, the rich rules over the poor, and the borrower becomes the lender's slave. Here again, I think this is one area where it's real dangerous. It's something that we can get into before we know what's happening. My wife and I have talked a lot about, in this case, a personal situation with respect to her sister and husband. They got married about the same time we did, had a pretty good job, but before they knew it, they were so enmeshed in debt that they didn't have a free dollar to go anywhere. They learned their lesson. Within a year or two, they escaped, or they didn't escape quite that quickly, but they escaped before long, and they've dealt with that since then. But it's interesting to notice, if you pick up a college thesaurus and look at how debt is defined, it talks about being answerable for, in embarrassed circumstances, being liable, chargeable, in difficulties, unrewarded, deeply involved, owing, in hoc, up against it, encumbered, insolvent. So you can understand why the proverb writer said, and the borrower becomes the lender's slave. Why is it such a problem? Well, let me give you some suggestions why I think it's such a problem. One is that it creeps up on you. In other words, you keep just getting a little bit further in debt. Secondly, it's such a way of life in this country. Thirdly, it's a matter of the way the advertisers try to get to us. Buy now and pay later. Or just 24 easy payments. So there's so many ways in which they're, in other words, working on us that I think it becomes easy for people to get into this trap of debt. How to solve it? The first element in any solution is to stop spending more than you make. And so that's the first point. Stop spending more than you make. We're to talk about that a little bit later. The second point is to pay the interest on the debt and to repay the debt. And I think that's what the Roman writer meant when he says, owe nothing to anyone, is that we're not to have outstanding debts and not to continue, in other words, in the debt of anyone. We're to repay those debts. And then I think we have to be content with what we have. There are some axioms to help avoid overspending that I might just share with you, and I think they hold fairly well. The more shopping we do, the more we spend. The more we watch TV, the more we spend. The more time we spend looking at catalogs, the more we spend. So avoid temptation in that area as well as in others. A third area that I want to look at, and very briefly, is a matter of saving and investing. Now, maybe I need to clarify what it is we're talking about here. I'm not talking about what's suggested here in this little set of visuals. Blondie says to Dagwood, these days I'm always running short of cash. Blondie said, I think you should put up some money for an emergency fund. Dagwood says, well, if I contribute the money, what do you contribute? Guess. So I'm not talking about quite the same thing that Blondie and Dagwood are talking about there, but I am talking about the need to prepare for emergencies, and I think savings does play an important role there. It can play some other important roles in terms of preparing for children going to college. It can prepare for retirement. And so, as well as the meeting emergencies, I think those are important points. Now, one passage in Proverbs, I think, deals with this. Proverbs 21, verse 20. Says Proverbs 1, verse 20 says, there is precious treasure and oil in the dwelling of the wise, but a foolish man swallows it up. In the New English, New International Version, it suggests a foolish man devours it. So really, in other words, essentially the idea of using it all up as we go, as opposed to having some available in the dwelling. Now, obviously, when we talk about savings investment, there's dangers involved. And I wouldn't want to leave you unaware of that or fail to mention that. 1 Timothy 6, verses 6, 10, and 11 talks about the love of money. It says, for the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many a pang. But flee from these things, you man of God. So, obviously, in other words, we want to watch that warning. We want to heed it. But I think there is a point, in other words, as I've indicated in terms of a balance here, to avoid some of the hassle, some of the frustration, some of the problems that we might otherwise encounter. I think there is a place for some saving. And one point I would make here is that you can save a little bit out of a little. If you don't save a little bit out of a little, I think this applies to both giving and saving. Giving to the Lord and saving. That if you don't do it when you've got a little, you're not going to do it when you get a lot. Because you'll find out, I take my word for it, I'm old enough to know, that you're always going to have things that you can use it for. And if you're not saving a little bit when you have a little bit and giving to the Lord, At that time, you're probably not going to do it when you have a lot. So that's a habit you need to develop at an early age. In this regard, and going back and talking about savings and investment, one of the things, just some cautions in terms of investment. Four or five of these that I want to mention. Some things that you need to watch for. The prospect of a large profit is practically guaranteed. In other words, these are some things, if you hear this stated, let it be a red light for you. If the prospect of a large profit is practically guaranteed. If the decision to invest must be made quickly. I'm sorry, but this deal just won't wait. You've got to sign on the dotted line tonight. The promoter's doing you a favor. In today's world, one of the points is that attractive tax deductions are the incentive. It's usually something that you don't know very much about. Very little is said about risk. And it doesn't require any effort on your part. And you're going to make a handsome profit quickly. Anytime you hear those kinds of comments or statements being made about an investment, watch it. My wife and I have found that it's usually best to discuss it and sleep on it. Nearly every time, if you sleep on it, you'll have given a lot more thought, and you can be much wiser about making an investment. If you don't, you're liable to wind up like is suggested in Ecclesiastes, the 5th chapter, verses 13 through 15. Ecclesiastes 5, verses 13 through 15. It says, "There is a grievous evil which I have seen under the sun, riches being hoarded by their owner to his hurt. When those riches were lost through a bad investment, and he had fathered a son, then there was nothing to support him." I mentioned this, discussing it and sleeping on it. My wife and I visited one of these retirement villages a few years ago. You know, they always have these come-ons. They'll furnish you free lodging for a weekend or something like this, and maybe even give you gas money and so forth if you visit. Well, they're trying to sell real estate, of course. If you haven't ever visited one, I'll tell you that's the catch. And we visited, and we went through. They toured us around and showed us all these delightful places and so forth, and they even showed us computer printouts showing how all of our friends in Columbia had bought these places and so forth. All kinds of gimmicks. He got around to trying to get us to sign. Then on the bottom line, we told him, well, we always think about something like this and wait till the next day before we decide whether we're going to do it or not. And it was interesting. This salesman actually said, "You know, I've never had anyone that waited until the next day that ever bought one." And I think that tells you a little bit about what happens then. Okay, the next area that we want to talk about, and this is one that gets down to the much more nitty-gritty, planning and budgeting. Let's see if I can get that up just a little bit. Planning and budgeting. Now here again, maybe we need to talk about what we're not suggesting. Dagwood, Blondie says to Dagwood, "This is terrible." She says, "I simply can't get my budget to balance." He asked her, says, "Have you ever thought about spending less money?" And Blondie says, "If you can't say something constructive, just don't say anything." Before I start talking about planning and budgeting, let me correct something on this. I think if I were drawing those visuals, I might have the roles just reversed. And I'll say something to the campus ministers who are here, or those who might hear this tape later, that I think in many cases it's the man that's at fault and the one that destroys the budget more than the woman. I've known some campus ministers, and I've known some wives that have to really ride herd on the financing, and I think in some cases the man is failing to provide the leadership in this area that he ought to be. He's not really being concerned enough about the problem. And so I think this is, as I say, I would probably reverse those cartoons there when it comes to planning and budgeting. When we talk about planning and budgeting, one of the suggestions is that this is one way to keep from having too much month left at the end of the money. Now, let me suggest to you that there's two steps in terms of planning and budgeting. And one of the first one of these is one that we sometimes ignore. First, we have to consider where we are today. And this means you need to know your income and your expenses. And I said, now we're getting down to the kind of the nitty-gritty here and some of the painful parts of this matter of management of personal finances. But I think this may be the most important thing that we're going to talk about, is that you have to have the necessary records in order to budget and plan. You have to know how you're spending your money. And I don't know how many of you do this, but if you're really concerned about this and if you really want to deal with this matter of managing personal finances, you need to keep a record of how you're spending your money. You may think, oh, I know where it goes, but I don't think you possibly can unless you keep an accurate record of it. My wife and I kept a very detailed record the first several years we were married. We knew just about where every penny goes. It's real interesting now to go back and look at some of those books in terms of how much we spent for groceries 27 years ago and that type of thing. It brings back the good old days. But the salary was good old days too at that time. We were living off of $300 a month. But the point is, you have to know where your money's going. And for one thing, that gives you some guidance then in terms of immediately knowing some things you're going to have to correct. Where am I spending more money than I need to be spending? And am I spending more than I think I am on food or clothing or recreation or what have you? And you need to look at that from the standpoint, how much am I spending on some of those items relative to how much I'm giving to the Lord? So I think that's probably, in other words, that's maybe one point that's often neglected when we talk about budgeting, is that the first thing you're going to have to do is really know where you're spending your money and start keeping a record of that. Then you can develop, I think, a much more meaningful budget. Second step is, of course, where we want to go. And there's two aspects to this. I've tried to tell one of my daughters this, and I'll admit I've not always been very successful, that you can either add to income or you can reduce the expenses. She just doesn't see reducing expenses. To her, she'd rather go out and get a... First, we have to consider where we are today. And this means you need to know your income and your expenses. And I said, now we're getting down to the kind of the nitty-gritty here and some of the painful parts of this matter of management of personal finances. But I think this may be the most important thing that we're going to talk about, is that you have to have the necessary records in order to budget and plan. You have to know how you're spending your money. And I don't know how many of you do this, but if you're really concerned about this and if you really want to deal with this matter of managing personal finances, you need to keep a record of how you're spending your money. You may think, oh, I know where it goes, but I don't think you possibly can unless you keep an accurate record of it. My wife and I kept a very detailed record the first several years we were married. We knew just about where every penny goes. It's real interesting now to go back and look at some of those books in terms of how much we spent for groceries 27 years ago and that type of thing. It brings back the good old days. But the salary was good old days too at that time. We were living off of $300 a month. But the point is, you have to know where your money's going. And for one thing, that gives you some guidance then in terms of immediately knowing some things you're going to have to correct. Where am I spending more money than I need to be spending? And am I spending more than I think I am on food or clothing or recreation or what have you? And you need to look at that from the standpoint, how much am I spending on some of those items relative to how much I'm giving to the Lord? So I think that's probably, in other words, that's maybe one point that's often neglected when we talk about budgeting, is that the first thing you're going to have to do is really know where you're spending your money and start keeping a record of that. Then you can develop, I think, a much more meaningful budget. Second step is, of course, where we want to go. And there's two aspects to this. I've tried to tell one of my daughters this, and I'll admit I've not always been very successful, that you can either add to income or you can reduce the expenses. She just doesn't see reducing expenses. To her, she'd rather go out and get a second job and work a little bit harder. I think for most of us and for most of you, particularly where you're working in the ministry, the only alternative you really have is to reduce expenses, because you typically can't add to income without either sacrificing time for the Lord or time for your family. And those are neither one very desirable alternatives. Now, the last thing I had down here in terms of our part is spending. And of course this relates to the budgeting. I want to talk about it in terms of what I perceive as being some road hazards. And you might think of these as being potholes or dead ends or a precipice just by the side of a very narrow road that you might fall off into. There may be sharp curves or what have you, but I think there's some things we need to watch for. Obviously, one of the things we have to watch is housing. Now, I'm going to be talking about some practical questions that I think you can ask yourselves at this point. We're getting away from the biblical content in the sense of scriptures that deal specifically with these, but all of this involved in being good stewards. As far as housing is concerned, how much housing can I afford? And we need to be careful in terms of the commitment we make there. Utilities is a part of that. And in that case, there's some things that we can control. We can control how much electricity we use to some extent. We can turn off a few lights. We can reduce the amount of water by showering just a little bit less, or turning off that shower while we're taking a shower. John, you never do having trouble with that, do you? I know my son and daughters do have in terms of turning off the shower. Telephone, that's included in utilities. And as much as we like to use it, that may be an area where we can cut down on some spending. And it's something so we have to think about, and say along with our housing. Automobiles. These are, of course, two of the areas where so much of our money goes. How new an automobile can I afford? How big an automobile? How sporty an automobile? One of the things that you really have to watch today in terms of the automobile area is the matter of payments. Because with the interest rates what they are today, it kills you to be borrowing very much money in terms of buying an automobile. It changes the whole balance with respect to whether a new car with no repairs is cheaper than an old car and making some repairs. In other words, you're probably going to be able to make some repairs to an older car, cheaper than you can buy a new car and make payments on it with the interest rate what it is today. So, as I say, that's just something you need to think about. I run across one idea suggests that it costs 35 cents a pound to operate a car. I'd hate to try to defend that amount, but they're making a point, of course, that it costs a lot more to operate a big car, and so that's one of the things we have to think about. If you figure, for example, that you drive 15,000 miles a year, and with gas at $1.25 presently, or more in many cases, many areas, it costs just about $1,000 more per year to drive a car that averages 10 miles a gallon compared to the one that averages 20 miles a gallon. So that's one of the kinds of things you need to look at in terms of the size of the car. How useful is the car? Can we haul another 2 or 3 people? I became very conscious of this, and I don't think Mark Mancini would mind me sharing this. When Mark came to work for us about 3 years ago, he just bought a new Camaro. Man, it was a nice car. Mark was so proud of it. It was his first car, and he was really proud of that Camaro. But when he started looking at the gas mileage, and he started looking at how convenient it was to try to put somebody in the back seat of that car, and some of those things, those are some of the kinds of things I think we need to look at with respect to a car. Clothing. That's another road hazard. For some people more than others. How much clothing can I wear? How can I afford? I mean, you don't need to wear very much as long as you're decent in this kind of weather. But how much do I need? How much clothing do I need? When should I buy it? And this is an important issue right here with respect to the cost of clothing. I'm sure most of you realize this, but in Columbia, for example, I never buy any clothing until the end of the season, because it's at least 1/4 and usually more than 1/4 off. So I think we have to raise a question with ourselves: do I buy it when I want it, or do I buy it when I can afford it? And I think that's an important point. How important are the brands? So just some of the questions we'd have to ask with respect to clothing. Polos, alligators are just good quality. And most of us can't afford the polos. Some of the other road hazards, and we'll look very quickly at those. Entertainment. Does it cost money? Does it have to cost money, the entertainment that we participate in? There's some very wholesome kinds of entertainment that don't cost very much money, and so I think we have to be selective there. Are the movies really worth what they cost? In most cases, no. But yet, if you're married and you and your wife go to a movie, that's about most places $6 or $7, or even more in some cases. Do that. Hopefully not once a week, but if you do it once a week, that's going to be a sizable amount, $300 a year that you're going to spend for movies. So just think about that from that standpoint. Are they really worth what they cost? Insurance. Now, obviously, insurance is one of the things I think that we need, and we talked about savings and investment a while ago. Insurance is not a good investment, typically, from the standpoint of looking at it as a way of investing, as a way of insuring, yes, but term insurance, and for most people, is by far the most economical. You can buy so much more insurance at so much less money. So be very careful in terms of the kind of insurance that you buy. And I would say use it only as an investment only if you don't have any willpower at all, because that's about how poor it is as an investment. Furniture, look at the alternatives. Sometimes a little refinishing or upholstering may be the way to go. I thought about working up some figures on how much we have invested in the furniture in our basement. We have 2 nice divans down there, but they've both been reupholstered, and one of them was given to us completely, and the other one is, we've been in Columbia 24 years, the other one's 24 years old. But a little upholstering and, of course, a lot of work on my wife's part has made that possible. And there are some things you can do in terms of furniture. Food. And here I want to, again, get fairly personal in terms of some of the kinds of things that I think we have to watch. One of the things is, of course, shopping. One of the suggestions that's often made is leave hungry husbands and children at home. And I think that's right. Because they're, hey, Mom, how about this? Or, hey, wife, how about this? This looks good. Also, in terms of shopping, use coupons, watch ads, and make a list. That's one of the typical suggestions made with respect to family economics, is make a list before you go shopping. Don't just go and buy what's there. A second point, and again here I may be getting personal, is in terms of taking lunch. And I know that many of you use lunch as an opportunity to get with someone, to talk to them, to help them in terms of counsel with them, or to, for that matter, study with them. But in some cases, you could do that just as well by carrying a lunch. And if you did that just once a week, I'll assure you that you'll save anywhere from $50 to $300 to $150 in a year, just carrying a lunch once a week. In other words, getting together with someone but saying, hey, let's bring our lunch and get together and have lunch. And as say, one thing, you'll probably eat less, and many of us need to do that. You'll also eat an awful lot cheaper. So again, I realize that there's times when you have to eat lunch or have lunch or eat out with someone when, in terms of your studies or your counseling and so forth. But that's just something that we need to watch. One of the things we have to be extremely careful about is eating away from home. My wife worked this data up for me and then said she about decided she wasn't going to show it to me because she's afraid she wouldn't get to eat out anymore, even at a fast food place. What we did was take the actual figures from the grocery ads and from the actual figures from specific eating places, and then we made some comparison here. We're, in all of these cases, trying to look at maybe four people, two couples getting together for either for hamburgers or for Kentucky Fried Chicken or for pizza. And by the way, you'll notice we're taking the cheap way out there. We only have cheese pizza. In general, you can just about roughly figure in terms of hamburgers and chicken and things like that. And by the way, on the chicken, we do not show any drinks there. That's assumed, in other words, that you brought the Kentucky Fried home and had it at home with, had the drinks there, the drinks that you'd purchased at a much lower price. But at any rate, you can just about say for chicken or for hamburgers and things of that nature, you're going to pay at least twice as much if you eat out as it'll cost you at home. So that's, again, I'm not suggesting we never do that, but we need to recognize the cost. Pizza, and that's one that's very popular, I know, with all of us, at least 3 times. She looked also at a Supreme Pizza, or what we typically call Supreme, one with everything on it, and it's even worse. Probably be 4 times. Now, keep in mind, we're talking here about just eating out at a fast food place. No tips. And if you look at, if we start talking about a nice restaurant, of course, that's going to be a lot worse in terms of comparison. Well, let's say that's something I think we just have to look at and have to think about. And I don't want to get in trouble with all the wives by suggesting that we never eat out or never do that. But I think there's a real temptation, particularly for those of you involved in campus ministries where you're all coming and going and have a lot of appointments and things. Well, we'll grab a hamburger. And so the point I'm just really suggesting is that we have to watch this, I think. One of the things that I think I have to emphasize for those of you that are married is that all of these require the husband and wife working together. Amos 3, verse 3 applies in this area just as in many others. Can two walk together except they be agreed? And so I would emphasize the idea that when we talk about managing personal finances, it should be something that is worked out jointly. And as I say, I emphasize to the men, don't make the wife be the heavy in this just because she has to watch and see whether or not money is available to buy groceries. Finally, in terms of our thinking about this whole area of financing, I think we ought to, in this area as well as in others, be willing to seek counsel. And where can we seek counsel? We can seek counsel, of course, first from the Lord. James 1, verse 5 talks about that. We need wisdom in the spending of our money just as in other areas. So one of the places we can seek counsel is from the Lord. We can also seek it from the Bible. Psalms 119, verse 24. Thy testimonies also are my delight. They are my counselors. And I think in dealing with financial matters, we've neglected the Scriptures too much. It's interesting to note, and I failed to mention this at the beginning, but how much of Jesus' teaching dealt with money. Did you ever think about that? How many of his parables, how many of his lessons dealt with money? He knew that it was going to be very much a part of our lives. And I think that's a good point. And then thirdly, seek counsel from godly men and women. I know many of you've looked at scriptures dealing with seeking counsel in other areas, but I think this also applies with respect to finances. Verse 22 of Proverb 15 says, "Without consultation, plans are frustrated, but with many counselors they succeed." And typically most congregations have people that have something to offer in terms of counseling with respect to finances. They may be people that may not be quite as helpful in some other areas, but in this area they may have some real expertise. Maybe it's insurance, maybe it's real estate, maybe it's just buying groceries, but they can have some real good advice for us. I think we have to keep in mind that reluctance to seek counsel on money matters may indicate one of about 4 or 5 things. One is that it might surface issues we would rather avoid. It may reveal a lack of disciplined spending. It may reveal an unrealistic budget. It may reveal a lack of communication in the family, or it may reveal a fear of having to give up something dear. So I think any of those can cause us to be kind of hesitant about seeking counsel in this area, but I think it's very important. Just some final comments then. Luke 16 verse 13 reminds us that we cannot serve both God and money. And I guess I think that by some care and some learning some practical, useful things with respect to management of our finances will help us to not have to worry so much about money. Now that may seem like a contradiction, but I think it's really true that if we can learn some good habits in terms of our management of our finances, that I think that will keep us from really having to worry so much about money. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in this topic. 1 Timothy 6 and 10, scripture we noticed earlier, emphasized the warning about the love of money. And certainly that's something I think we all need to recognize. There's a passage in Ecclesiastes, the 7th chapter, verse 14, that I think is useful in terms of our attitude. Ecclesiastes 7, verse 14 says, "In the days of prosperity be happy, but in the days of adversity consider, God has made the one as well as the other." Going back to our passage that we looked at in the beginning, Philippians 4, verses 12 and 13, Paul says, "I have learned the secret." So I'll leave the thought with you that contentment is a secret learned, not earned. I thank you. I guess we have about 4 or 5 minutes if any of you have questions. Yes.
We're in the process of moving, and where we live now, we own our home, and it's financed very low mortgage rate. Would you recommend renting that home because that mortgage rate's coming down, or
Well, your alternatives may not be too great. You're probably going to have to do one of 2 things. You're probably either going to have to rent it, or else if you sell it, you're probably going to have to carry some of the financing. The wisdom of renting it probably will be contingent to some extent on the availability of someone that you trust to help take care of it. Because if you're somewhere else, that's sometimes a problem in terms of renting property, unless you have someone there that's willing to and able to take care of it for you. As far as the interest rate coming down, and here I'm speculating to some extent, but I don't expect any major decline very quickly. It may come down a point or two, but I don't see anything. And some of my colleagues that follow this a little bit closer than I do essentially say the same thing. Yes.
Do you have any advice about retirement funds for that?
Well, one of the things that I think is quite important is, of course, in many cases, ministers ministers have a choice, of course, initially as to whether they take Social Security or whether they set up some kind of annuity. Many do not choose to take Social Security. I think it's important, if they don't, that they try to take up some kind of annuity. In our congregation here, I guess we have 3 full-time men. One of them is on Social Security. The other 2, one of them has an annuity, and the other one we'll be encouraging to take out some kind of annuity. And we stand willing in the congregation here to put the same thing into their annuity as we would have to put into their Social Security. But I think it's important to plan some kind of retirement. Yes, I think, whether you're even if you're under Social Security, there probably is going to be a need for some additional retirement funds, and I think that's part of what I was talking about and what I would include under that heading of saving and investment. Other questions or comments, arguments with anything that I said? Yes. Well, that's pretty hard to generalize. If they could find one that they could get good financing on and they could handle, then I think so, yes, because it allows them to. You have to watch this in terms of what's happening in the real estate market, but I think in some cases it helps them to start accumulating some equity over time. We established a policy here several years ago that we decided not to buy a home to have available for preachers because it varied so much in terms of what they needed and wanted and so forth. And we established a policy that we would help them. We established a fund to provide them a little bit of help in terms of the down payment, so that if they did want to buy their home, that would help in that regard. But yes, if they can find something that meets their needs and is well suited to their family, and say as with any real estate, if it looks like a good piece of property, then I would say yes.
I heard that if you're selling a house and to sell it, you get a second mortgage, that you're losing money if you refinance the house so someone else can buy it. You ever heard that?
You mean you own the house and you're selling it and you're carrying?
You had a 5%, or you have an 8% assumable loan, but you've got $50,000 that needs to be paid down. That if you find that if you get a second mortgage on that, or if you finance it, you're really losing money. I don't understand that.
Well, you have to watch what you're doing in terms of the combination of interest rates that you pay, for example, on the initial mortgage and the second mortgage. In other words, as compared to some lending institution, for that matter, will give you a new loan and kind of combine those two. That might be better in some cases than the old loan plus the.
I think you're misunderstanding.
Okay, you're talking about selling it?
Yeah, I'm talking about selling it.
Okay, well,
do you recommend,
carrying it?
Yeah.
Carrying the second mortgage. Well, some cases that's not a choice. In some cases that's the only way you can sell a house. Now, in other words, in many instances today, that's people are forced to do that. Now, you have to be real careful because depends on what your situation is. If you're going to have to buy another house, then you may be in trouble in terms of carrying that one and not getting as much there as you're going to have to pay on another house and so forth. So that would be real difficult to generalize and say, well, by carrying a mortgage, second mortgage, you're going to lose money.
I don't think that's necessarily.
Not necessarily true, no. I need to say it depends on your need for the funds.
You can even insure that, can't you?
Yes, oh yes. You can require them to carry insurance.
If the fellow doesn't pay it, doesn't make his payments, you can still insure that.
Other questions or comments? Well, I appreciate your interest in this subject, and I'll be glad to visit with the rest of you anytime while we're here if you have any other questions. Thank you very much.